broadcasting live from the School of Athens. This is Europe and the People Without History with Mr. Olson, everyone's favorite AP World History Review service. Today we are coming at you with a very special edition of Europe and the People Without History where we talk about how to write the stinking DBQ. So just to give you a little bit of an outline of what your entire AP exam is going to look like, Section 1 will be the multiple choice questions and the short answers. Hopefully you've covered those by now. And Section 2 will be the writing. It will be a 100-minute period that you manage to write both a DBQ and a long essay. Now looking a little bit more closely at that Section 2, note that you are suggested to spend 15 minutes reading the documents for the DBQ, and then 45 minutes writing it. The DBQ comprises 25% of your overall exam score, making it the most heavily weighted question on the exam. Part B of Section 2 of your exam is going to be the long essay, which of course is one question that you spend roughly 40 minutes on, but it's only 15%. So many of you will spend more time on the DBQ than the LEQ, and some of you might even spill over into LEQ time. That is totally fine. Here are some DBQ basics, because that's going to be our focus for today. Like I said, 60 minutes. It's going to be one essay prompt. Oftentimes they might throw in two parts to the question, but lately it's only been one pretty clear and pretty obvious prompt or question. At the end, hopefully you're going to have a multi-paragraph essay, which I will show you how to write in a little bit with a hot introduction, 2 to 3 body paragraphs, depending on the prompt, and a stop conclusion. They are going to give you 7 documents, no more, no less. On the AP test, your goal is going to be to incorporate 6 of the documents into your answer and source 3 of them. We'll talk about what that sourcing verb means in just a second. If you are in my class, the expectation during the year is that you incorporate 7 of the 7 documents and source 4, because building in a spare tire is never a bad idea. Listen, I've graded the AP World History DBQ and the AP US History DBQ, and I can tell you they love throwing in at least one document that throws off every student. So if you can include 7 and source 4, you're in much better shape. You also need to include a piece of outside information to show that you know information about history beyond what is just in the documents. So overall, that makes your goal in this DBQ essay to answer a specific prompt with a specific response, which means you have to read that prompt carefully. I have read students who have written responses that didn't read the prompt carefully and they wrote about the wrong century. You can't let that happen. You have to read it carefully. Make sure you make note of dates, you make note of historical thinking skill, and you make note of regions and or themes that come up in the class. In addition to being able to answer a question specifically and with an argument, you need to show that you know how to analyze documents. Listen, the DBQ is basically the College Board's assessment as to whether or not you can evaluate a primary source. They just throw it into, written form, which means you have to show them that you know how to analyze documents. You cannot summarize or quote them, because that doesn't show that you know how to analyze them. That just shows that you know how to copy them. And then lastly, you need to show that you know something beyond the documents, because it is a history class and knowing information is relatively important. Now, the most important thing that establishes sort of the foundation of any essay is the so-called historical thinking skill or historical reasoning skill. This is something that the College Board has built into most of its essay questions pretty clearly. So hopefully after reading the essay prompt 2, probably 3 times, you should be able to tell if they're asking you to compare, talk about cause or effect, or talk about change over time. So look for words like changed, continuity, similarity, differences, causes, effects, or shaped. Those should give you the clue as to what type of question you are dealing with. Now, this might be very helpful for most students out there. This nice little chart that we've created for you here goes through the 3 historical thinking skills. Sorry, it says 4, but I mean 3, and tells you a suggestion for how to analyze or how to organize that essay. So for example, let's say you get a change in continuity essay. Your goal in that essay is going to identify multiple continuities or changes, depending on what the prompt asks you for, and make sure that each specific continuity or change is identified in your thesis. So very clearly say, these are the changes I'm going to be talking about, or these are the continuities I'm going to be talking about. Now, there is a way that you can organize this in terms of trying to get the complexity point, which is, of course, very elusive and difficult. Nevertheless, here is one suggestion. If your prompt asks you only for continuity or only for change, then you can dedicate one full body paragraph to each continuity or change you have identified. For example, if you're asked how something changed something, you could do body paragraph 1 is on change 1, body paragraph 2 on change 2. Or you could talk about both continuity and change, which means body paragraph 1 on continuity, body paragraph 1 on change, because usually they're asking you to evaluate the change, which means you can say that it didn't change at all. So keeping that in mind, let's consider a question. Evaluate the extent to which Mongol cultural practices changed in response to Mongol interactions with conquered people in the period circa 1200 to 1350. How many times should you read that to be successful? 3. The first step to being successful on the DBQ on the AP World exam, read the question 3 times. Once you've read it 3 times, that last time that you go through, you should annotate it. So when I read it and annotate it, it'll look something like this. Evaluate the extent, which just means how much, to which Mongol cultural practices changed in response to Mongol interactions with conquered people in the period circa 1200 to 1350. There is my annotated question. I have identified the historical thinking skill, I have identified the theme, cultural practices, and what they want me to do with it, what extent or how much. So basically, they're asking me how much the Mongols changed because of their interactions with other people. Now, steps to a successful DBQ, read that question 3 times and annotate it as to what it requires you to do. Then read the documents. Look for common themes to include in your thesis. You want to use these themes to craft what your answer is going to say. So even though you might think you have an answer to that question before even reading the documents, you have to read the documents first. Once you read the documents, then you can come up with an idea of how to organize it. So when you organize your evidence to say this question, remember we said before, you're going to have a body paragraph either on a set of changes, and then another body paragraph on another set of changes, because the question is asking me specifically about change. Or I could have a body paragraph on changes and a body paragraph on continuities, because it's evaluating the extent, how much. You can say they didn't change at all if you want to. You can say they lived in their yurts and then they lived in their yurts. It's a continuity there. Okay, so that's the prep, the lead up. Now let's talk about what you're going to write actually in the essay. So the first thing that you want to do in your introduction, which I know is the hardest part for many of you to write, is you want to bust out with an amazing hoe. Now, here's what I mean by that. Don't let your minds go into the gutter on this one. Your historical overview, or what the College Board calls contextualization, is where you situate the question into the broader narrative of history. So this is where you show that you understand that the prompt that they're asking you about doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not like this thing happening all by itself, separate from everything else in history. So here's what you should remember in order to write an amazing historical overview. The first sentence should describe the time period before the question. So like what's happening just relatively before, right before, around 1200 that is leading to this question being an askable topic. Follow that up with 2 to 3 sentences that describe the time period of the question that they're asking you about. So remember, the question's asking you about 1200 to 1350. So like what's happening a little bit before 1200? You could talk about Chinese golden ages, the Islamic golden age, European dark ages, the emergence of, more integrated trade routes during the post-classical era, opening up of connectivity between different world regions. That's a good place to start. Then get more specific about what's happening, particularly in East Asia, particularly between 1200 and 1350. Here's how you do not write a historical overview. Many students want to just immediately start with like an event that they all know about. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He was a jerk, but eventually Spain took over the New World. No, that is not a good historical overview. That does nothing for us other than, know that you sang a song when you were in the 3rd grade about Columbus. Okay? Also, avoid starting with something so incredibly vague that you leave the reader in suspense. How do you keep a reader in suspense? You don't tell them anything. That's exactly how. So your first sentence should show explicit knowledge of history. Listen, I'm going to let you into a little secret. When someone reads your essay, the first sentence says a lot about you. And even though the readers are not supposed to judge you by that first sentence, I bet some of them do. Okay, so avoid common knowledge or simple observations, and absolutely avoid the phrase throughout history, because you're not talking about all of history. You're just talking about 1200 to 1350. Okay, now let's talk about the TT, or the thorough thesis. This is where you are going to answer the question. This is the nucleus of your essay. It's the most important part, because not only does it tell the reader what you are going to talk about, but it tells the reader how it's going to be organized and what you are going to argue. So it should answer all parts of the question and should be break-upable. And what do I mean by that? Well, I should be able to slice it up like with a knife or something and basically connect it or disconnect it out into different paragraphs. I should be able to tell what the paragraphs are based on your thesis. Once you've done that, it's time for you to go on and talk about the documents, which is what you do in the body paragraph. The body paragraphs are where you use the documents really to support your answer. So you figured out what paragraph they're going to go in when you read them, and you categorize them by way of some sort of organizational strategy, hopefully. Now, in the body paragraph, you discuss the document's main idea first, elaborate on it by saying how it connects to your thesis, and then source it. So I'm going to say those first two again because they're you can't do the third without doing the first two. Introduce the document by saying what the main idea of it. Show that you know what it is saying and why it is there. Don't quote it. Don't summarize it. Paraphrasing is okay, but it has to be in such a way that it shows your understanding. Again, there will be 7 and only 7. You need to use at least 6 on the AP test. 7 if you are in my class. Now, once you've provided the main idea and given an idea of why or how it connects to your thesis, that's where for 4 of them, 3 on the AP test, 4 if you're in my class, you need to source them. Sourcing is where you show that you understand that a document is not necessarily created objectively, that it's always going to have some sort of bias. You don't have to use the word bias. You don't have to use the word, sourcing in your essay. In fact, usually bias throws students off, so I wouldn't even suggest using the phrase bias. But this is where you talk about the fact that documents aren't necessarily created in a vacuum objectively, right? There are things influencing the documents when they are created. So this is where you choose one of these things to talk about for 4 of the documents. Okay, that's your goal. 4, 3 on the AP test, 4 in my class. You can talk about historical context, which in U.S. history is the most common. It's a little bit harder in world because we sort of don't talk about that many specifics, but you could try it. How did the historical events that are occurring at that time period shape the creation of the document? You need to know, like for the example we're talking about right now, you need to know some specifics about the Mongols. Not sure that every class went into that, so that might be difficult. Now, the last 3 are a little bit easier. Audience. Who is it intended for, and how might that affect their message? Point of view. Who wrote it? What's the background of the author, and how might that influence their message? And then finally, purpose. Why is the author doing this? Why are they writing it? Why are they drawing it? Why are they making it? And how might that influence what they are saying? Okay? It's helping you recognize that documents are usually created for a reason or because of some sort of existential pressure, and that, of course, is going to influence what's in there. Now, if you ever forget what these things are, don't worry. Don't worry, there's an acronym for that. HAPPY. That's right. Think HAPPY. And then you'll remember historical context, audience, purpose, point of view. Now, there are some places in your essay that you should never, ever use a document, and this rule might help save you. So remember Rule 473, which says that you should never, ever use a document anywhere in your introduction because there's no room to analyze it there. Your introduction is where you're introducing context and thesis. Never do it in the first and last sentence of any paragraph because no time to analyze it there. Conclusion, no time to analyze. 2 consecutive sentences, no time to analyze. Any place that you don't have time to analyze a document, don't use one. Now, in addition to the documents, you also need to try and use one solid piece of outside evidence. This is something that's totally outside of the documents, cannot be referenced in the documents, cannot be alluded to in the documents, needed to be something totally detached from the documents that you are given. This is very, very challenging, and it is why you need to do things like read the book. When you give your outside information, it should be 2 to 3 sentences, well developed, and explaining how it relates to your thesis. So in this case, you should be asking yourself, what do you know about the Mongols and their interactions with other groups that is not accounted for in the documents? That's what you would be asking yourself in this case. In another prompt, you'd be asking yourself, what is related to that prompt that I know that's not in the documents? Once you've written your 2 to 3 body paragraphs, it's time for you to get on to your conclusion, but truth be told, a lot of you won't have time for this one. So this is where you, of course, ST, state your thesis one more time, or an OP, own your point, trying to get historical complexity. You can do this by accounting for multiple aspects of an argument, talking about, in this case, continuities and changes, and explaining why one of them was more important than the other. You can rank multiple changes, in this case, and talking about why one change was more influential than another one. You can explain relevant or insightful connections between this time period and another place or time period in world history. You can modify an argument by considering alternative views or evidence, but that one is going to be kind of difficult. Most of you are going to be up here in the first 3 bullet points. Okay, so that's how you write the essay. Now let's do a little check-in. Can you identify how a DBQ is different than an LEQ? Can you tell how an introduction is similar or different? They're both the same. How about the body paragraphs? Well, in a DBQ, you get the documents given to you for evidence. In an LEQ, no such luck. Conclusion should look exactly the same. Sourcing is what you do to help identify that you understand that a document was not created on its own in a vacuum, and then ultimately the sourcing comes down to HAP. That's how you remember them. Now, in terms of writing a DBQ, where are you right now? Are you a no I can't, or are you a yes you can? Hopefully this has helped you get to the yes we can. That's all the time we have for today. This is your Buddha, Mongol Buddha, signing off.